The knife was still in her hand when the doors broke open. Maren did not scream. She had promised herself, long before this night, that screaming was a thing she would never give her father the satisfaction of hearing. She stood in the kitchen with her back against the cold stone wall, the small blade gripped so tight her knuckles had turned white, while 6 armed men filled the room like water filling a cracked jar. "Put it down," said the tallest one, his voice flat, almost bored, as if he had said this exact sentence 100 times before to 100 other frightened women. "Where is my father?" Maren said, not a question, a demand. Nobody answered her. Instead, the tall man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it toward her, the way someone might hold out a piece of bread to a starving animal, careful, but without any real kindness behind the gesture. She did not take it. He unfolded it himself and read it aloud, and every word landed on her like a stone dropped from a great height. Her father had sold her. Not metaphorically. Not as some old, dusty custom from a story her grandmother used to tell. He had signed his name at the bottom of a real document, promising his only daughter to the Voss pack in exchange for the clearing of a debt that had been eating away at their family for 3 long years. The debt was gone now. She had taken its place. Maren's hand loosened around the knife handle. It fell to the stone floor with a sound sharper than she expected, ringing through the small kitchen like a bell announcing the end of something. "You have 10 minutes, the tall man said. "Bring only what you need." But she looked past him, toward the hallway, hoping to see her father standing there, hoping there had been some terrible mistake, some misunderstanding that he would rush in to correct. But the hallway stayed empty. He was not coming. He had already left the house before these men arrived, unwilling, or unable, to watch what he had done unfold in front of him. Her mother stood frozen by the staircase, her hands pressed over her mouth, tears sliding silently down her face. But she said nothing either. Nobody in this house was going to fight for her. Maren understood that now, completely, the way you understand cold water the moment it closes over your head. Her younger brother, Colin, appeared at the top of the stairs in his sleep clothes, rubbing his eyes, too young to understand what was happening but old enough to sense that something was deeply wrong. Maren looked at him and forced her face into something calm, something reassuring, because if she was going to lose everything tonight, she was not going to let him lose his sense of safety too. "Go back to bed," she told him gently. "Everything is fine." It was not fine. Nothing about this was fine. She walked up the stairs past her frozen mother, into her small bedroom, and began pulling things from her closet with hands that would not stop shaking. A coat, a pair of boots, a photograph of her grandmother, the only person in this family who had ever truly loved her without conditions attached. She wrapped the photograph in a scarf and pressed it deep into her bag, as if hiding it from the men downstairs would somehow keep it safe from whatever was coming. When she came back down, the tall man checked his pocket watch and nodded once, satisfied that she had followed his timeline. He gestured toward the door. "The car is waiting." Maren paused at the threshold of the house she had grown up in, turning back one final time. Her mother had not moved from the staircase. Her father was nowhere to be found. There would be no goodbye, no apology, no explanation offered. "Tell him," Maren said, her voice steady despite everything breaking apart inside her chest, "that I hope the debt was worth it." Nobody answered. She stepped out into the cold night air and did not look back again. The car ride to the border of Voss territory took almost 4 hours, and for every one of those minutes, Maren stared out the window at the passing trees, replaying the last conversation she'd had with her father just 2 days earlier. He had seemed distracted, quieter than usual, but she had assumed it was ordinary pack business, nothing more. She had not noticed the signs. She had not seen this coming, and that failure to see it felt almost as painful as the betrayal itself. The men in the car spoke very little to her. When they did speak, it was only logistics, instructions about where to sit, when they would stop, what she should expect upon arrival. Nobody explained why the Voss pack wanted her specifically, and nobody seemed to think she deserved an explanation. She was cargo now, property changing hands. The weight of that realization settled into her stomach like a stone she would carry for the rest of her life. Somewhere around the 2nd hour of the drive, exhaustion began to pull at her, and despite everything, despite the fear and the anger and the grief threatening to swallow her whole, her body eventually surrendered to sleep. She dreamed of nothing. It was, strangely, the kindest thing that happened to her all night. She woke as the car slowed, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and lifted her head to see iron gates rising out of the darkness ahead, tall enough to block out half the night sky. Torches lined the long driveway beyond the gates, casting flickering orange light across stone walls that seemed to stretch on forever. This was not a house. This was a fortress, built by people who understood exactly how much power they held, and were not shy about displaying it. The car pulled through the gates and came to a stop in a wide courtyard already filled with waiting figures. Maren counted at least a dozen of them, standing in neat, silent rows, watching the car with expressions she could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps. Suspicion, certainly. Something else too. Something she couldn't name yet. The door beside her opened, and the tall man who had escorted her the entire journey offered his hand to help her out. She ignored it, climbing out on her own, refusing to accept even the smallest gesture of assistance from any of these people who had taken her from everything she knew. Cold air hit her face immediately, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and forced herself to look composed even though every part of her wanted to fold in on itself and disappear. A woman stepped forward from the waiting crowd, older, dressed in dark, practical clothing, her expression unreadable. "You will follow me," she said simply. "The Alpha King will see you shortly." Maren's stomach tightened at the title. She had heard stories about the Voss Alpha King. Whispers passed between frightened pack members in her old territory. Stories about his strength, his coldness, his complete lack of mercy toward anyone who crossed him. She had assumed, based on those stories, that he would be exactly the sort of man capable of accepting a woman as payment for a debt without a single thought about what that meant for her. She followed the woman through a heavy wooden door and into a long stone corridor lit by torches every few steps. Her footsteps echoed loudly against the silence, and she became acutely aware of every eye that followed her from the shadows, pack members watching the newcomer with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open hostility. They walked for what felt like a very long time before finally stopping outside a set of double doors, taller than any door Maren had ever seen, carved with images of wolves running through forests she did not recognize. The woman knocked twice, waited for a response Maren couldn't hear, and then pushed the doors open. The room beyond was massive, warmed by a fire burning in a hearth large enough to stand inside. And there, standing near the window with his back turned toward the door, was a man Maren immediately understood to be the Alpha King. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than any man she had ever seen, dressed simply in dark clothing that somehow still managed to convey enormous authority. When he turned to face her, Maren felt something strange happen in her chest. A small jolt of recognition she could not explain, as if she had seen this exact face somewhere before, though she knew with absolute certainty that she had not. His eyes moved over her slowly, and for a brief moment something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like shock, quickly hidden behind a mask of careful neutrality. His gaze lingered on her collarbone, where the collar of her coat had shifted slightly, revealing the edge of an old scar shaped like a crescent moon. "Leave us," he said, his voice low and commanding, directed at the woman who had escorted Maren inside. The woman bowed slightly and withdrew, closing the heavy doors behind her, leaving Maren alone in the room with the man who now, according to a piece of paper her father had signed, owned her completely. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maren refused to be the first to break the silence, standing perfectly still, her chin lifted, refusing to let him see even a trace of the fear churning inside her. "You have a scar," the Alpha King finally said, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain, a tone that seemed strange coming from a man who commanded an entire pack. "I have many scars," Maren replied evenly. "I imagine most people do." Something shifted behind his eyes, something she could not name. He took a step closer, then stopped himself, as if catching his own movement before it could go any further. "My apologies," he said. "That was not the way I intended to begin this conversation." "Is there a way you intended to begin it?" Maren asked, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "Because from where I'm standing, my father sold me like livestock, and I was driven 4 hours through the night to a stranger's fortress, and now that same stranger is staring at my scars, instead of explaining what happens next." To her surprise, something almost like guilt passed over his face. "You're right," he said. "I owe you an explanation, and I intend to give you one. But not tonight. Tonight you're exhausted and frightened, and you have every right to be both of those things. Tomorrow, I will tell you everything." "And tonight?" she asked. "Tonight," he said. "You'll be shown to your own room, with a door that locks from the inside. Nobody will disturb you. Nobody will touch you. I give you my word on that, for whatever it's worth to a stranger." Maren studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that his words were simply a performance meant to lower her guard. She found none, which somehow unsettled her more than if she had. "Why should I believe you?" she asked quietly. The Alpha King held her gaze steadily. "You don't have to believe me yet. You only have to see whether I keep my word. Trust is something earned through actions, not promised through words. I understand that better than most. He called the woman back into the room, instructed her to show Maren to her quarters, and as Maren turned to leave, she felt his eyes still on her, watching her go with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. She was led up a wide staircase and down another long corridor before finally stopping at a door near the end. Inside was a bedroom far larger and more comfortable than anything she had expected. A fire already burning in the small hearth, warm blankets folded neatly on the bed. The woman left without another word, and Maren immediately walked to the door and turned the lock, testing it twice to be certain it held. Only then did she allow herself to sit down on the edge of the bed, and only then did the tears finally come, quiet and exhausted. The tears of someone who had held herself together through an impossible night and simply could not do it any longer. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or what explanation the Alpha King thought he owed her, or why his eyes had lingered on her scar, as though it meant something to him that she could not yet understand. All she knew was that her old life was gone, taken from her not by force alone but by betrayal from the very people who should have protected her, and whatever came next, she would have to face it completely on her own. Outside her window, the torches along the courtyard walls burned steadily against the darkness, and somewhere deep within the fortress, the Alpha King stood alone in his study, staring at nothing, his mind replaying the moment he had seen her walk through his doors, and the scar on her collarbone that matched, exactly, the one he had dreamed about for 3 long years. He had never told anyone about those dreams, not his advisors, not his closest friends, not a single soul within his pack. A woman with dark hair and steady eyes, and a crescent scar upon her collarbone, appearing in his sleep night after night for 3 years, always just out of reach, always disappearing before he could learn her name. Tonight, she had walked into his life exactly as she had appeared in his dreams, except she was real, and she was standing in his fortress, because her own father had sold her away like an object, with no value beyond what debt it could erase. He did not believe in coincidence. He had lived too long, seen too much, to dismiss something like this as simple chance. Something larger was happening here, something neither of them yet understood, and he intended to uncover exactly what it meant, no matter how long it took or what it cost him to find out. For now, though, he would let her rest. Tomorrow, the explanations would begin, and with them, a story neither of them could have predicted, one that would change everything they thought they knew about fate, about family, and about the strange, unshakable pull between two people who had somehow found each other across the walls of dreams and deaths and broken promises. The fire in his study burned low, and outside, the wind moved through the pine trees surrounding his fortress, carrying with it the quiet certainty that nothing about tomorrow would be simple, and nothing about this woman would be easy to ignore. Morning came through the tall windows of the fortress in thin gray light, and Maren woke with her body stiff from a night spent curled tightly at the edge of the unfamiliar bed. For a moment, in the space between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then the memory returned all at once, heavy and cold, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Someone had left a folded set of clothes on the chair near the door sometime during the night, without waking her. She dressed slowly, running her fingers over the fine fabric, wondering what kind of household kept clothing in her exact size ready for a stranger arriving without warning. Nothing about this place made sense yet, and that uncertainty frightened her more than open hostility would have. A knock came at the door just as she finished dressing. She opened it to find the same older woman from the night before, standing with her hands folded neatly in front of her. "The Alpha King requests your presence for breakfast," the woman said. "My name is Greta. I oversee the household staff here." "Do I have a choice?" Maren asked. Greta's expression softened slightly, just enough for Maren to notice. "You always have a choice, though I suspect refusing breakfast on your first morning will only delay the conversation you're owed. Better to have it now, while you're rested, than later, while you're hungry and irritable." There was something almost kind in the way Greta said this, and despite herself, Maren felt the smallest thread of trust begin to form. She followed the woman down the same long corridor from the night before, then through a different set of doors into a smaller, sunlit room where a table had been set with more food than Maren had seen in weeks. The Alpha King was already seated, rising slightly when she entered, a gesture of respect that caught her off guard. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with dark hair and sharp eyes that studied her with open curiosity, rather than the cold calculation she had braced herself for. "Please," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Sit, eat something. We can talk after, if you're willing." Maren sat down carefully, keeping her posture stiff, unwilling to relax fully in the presence of a man she still did not trust. You said you owed me an explanation, she said, skipping past any pleasantries. I'd rather have it now than pretend to enjoy breakfast first. A small, surprised smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Very well, direct. I can respect that. He set down the cup he had been holding and folded his hands together on the table. My name is Draven Voss. I am the Alpha King of this pack, though I imagine you already knew that much. I know the title, Maren said. I don't know why it matters that I'm here. Draven was quiet for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. 3 years ago, I began having dreams, the same dream, over and over, night after night. A woman with dark hair and a scar shaped like a crescent moon upon her collarbone. I never saw her face clearly, and I never learned her name, no matter how many times the dream repeated itself. Maren's hand rose instinctively to the collar of her shirt, covering the scar hidden beneath the fabric. That's not possible, she said, though her voice wavered slightly as she said it. I understand your disbelief, Draven said. I did not believe it myself, not entirely, until last night, when you walked through my doors, and I saw that same scar, exactly where I had seen it in my dreams for 3 years. So what does that mean? Maren asked, her voice rising slightly despite her attempt to stay calm. That I'm supposed to believe some kind of fate brought me here? That my father selling me like property was somehow meant to happen? No, Draven said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that made Maren pause. What your father did was wrong, and nothing about fate excuses that. I make no claim on you because of a dream, Maren. I only tell you the truth of what I've experienced, because I believe you deserve honesty, especially after the deception you've already suffered at the hands of someone who should have protected you. Maren studied his face carefully, searching again for any trace of manipulation, any hint that this story of dreams was simply an elaborate performance meant to make her more compliant. She found nothing but sincerity, which unsettled her far more than a lie would have. What happens to me now? She asked quietly. That depends on what you want, Draven said. The debt your father owed has been settled through your arrival here. Legally, you are considered part of this pack's household now, but I will not treat you as property, regardless of what that document says. You will have your own rooms, your own freedoms within the boundaries of the territory, and time to decide what you want your life here to look like. And if I want to leave? Maren asked. Something flickered across Draven's expression, quickly hidden. Then we would need to discuss what that means for the debt, and for your safety, given the reason your father made this arrangement in the first place. But I will not hold you here against your will, Maren. That much I can promise you. The conversation continued through breakfast, Draven answering her questions patiently, revealing pieces of information about the pack, the territory, the reasons behind the debt her father had accumulated. Maren learned that her father had borrowed heavily from the Voss pack years earlier, using the loan to cover losses from a series of poor decisions that had nearly bankrupted their smaller pack entirely. The debt had grown over the years, interest compounding, until it reached a size her father could never hope to repay through ordinary means. He could have told me, Maren said quietly, more to herself than to Draven. He could have explained the situation instead of doing this behind my back. Some men find it easier to make impossible choices when they don't have to look the person they're hurting in the eye first, Draven said. That doesn't make it right. It only makes it cowardly. After breakfast, Draven offered to show her around the fortress grounds, and though Maren hesitated, some instinct told her that understanding this place, learning its layout and its people, would serve her better than remaining locked away in her room out of fear. She agreed, and they walked together through wide stone hallways and out into a courtyard where several pack members were training, their movements fast and precise. The pack members paused when they noticed Draven approaching, straightening with visible respect, though their eyes moved curiously toward Maren walking beside him. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing against her skin, and she fought the urge to shrink away from it. They're wondering who you are, Draven said quietly, noticing her discomfort. Word travels quickly in a pack this size. By tonight, everyone will know the story, or at least some version of it. Will they resent me? Maren asked. For being here? Draven considered the question seriously before answering. Some might, at first. Change unsettles people, especially in a pack as old and traditional as this one, but I suspect most will come to understand, given time, that you arrived here through no fault of your own, and that how you conduct yourself matters far more than how you arrived. They continued walking, Draven pointing out different buildings, explaining the history of the fortress, the founding of the Voss pack generations earlier, the responsibilities he carried as Alpha King. Maren listened carefully, cataloging every detail, aware that knowledge of this place might prove valuable, regardless of what she eventually decided to do with her situation. As the sun rose higher, They arrived at a quiet garden tucked behind the main fortress building, sheltered by tall stone walls and filled with flowers Maren did not recognize, their colors deep and vibrant against the gray stone surrounding them. "This was my mother's garden," Draven said, his voice softening slightly. "She passed several years ago. I maintain it in her memory, though I confess I have little skill with growing things myself. The staff manages most of the actual care." Maren looked around the garden, noticing the careful arrangement of the flowers, the small stone bench positioned to catch the morning light. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "She must have loved it very much." "She did," Draven said. "She used to say that a garden teaches patience better than any lesson a teacher could offer. Everything grows in its own time, regardless of how badly you want to rush the process." Something in his words settled over Maren quietly, and for the first time since the previous night, she felt a small measure of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She was not foolish enough to trust this man completely. Not yet. Not after everything her own father had done to her. But she found herself, despite every instinct telling her to remain guarded, beginning to believe that perhaps this place would not be the prison she had feared it might become. They sat together on the stone bench for a while, saying little, simply existing in the quiet morning air. Eventually, Draven rose, explaining that pack business required his attention for the remainder of the day, but he assured her that Greta would help her settle into her new quarters and answer any questions that arose. As he walked away, Maren remained on the bench a moment longer, watching the flowers move gently in the breeze, turning over everything she had learned in the space of a single morning. A dream spanning 3 years. A debt spanning even longer. A man who claimed no ownership over her despite every legal right to do so. None of it made sense yet, and she suspected the full truth of her situation would take considerably longer than one morning to fully understand. But for the first time since the men had broken into her father's kitchen the previous night, Maren felt something other than fear settling into her chest. She felt, very cautiously, the smallest possibility of hope. Days passed, and Maren began to learn the rhythm of the fortress the way a person learns the rhythm of a new song, slowly, then all at once. She woke early, before most of the household stirred, and walked the long stone corridors while the halls were still quiet, memorizing every turn, every door, every window that offered a view of the surrounding forest. Greta had become something close to a friend during those early days, patient with Maren's questions, willing to explain the customs and history of the Voss pack without judgment. It was Greta who first told her about the council, a group of senior pack members who advised Draven on matters of territory, trade, and defense, and it was Greta who warned her, gently but clearly, that not everyone on that council approved of her presence in the fortress. "They worry about complications," Greta explained one morning, while helping Maren arrange her few belongings in the wardrobe of her new quarters. "A woman brought in through a debt settlement is one thing. A woman the Alpha King seems drawn to is another thing entirely, especially to men who have spent years arranging a more strategic match for him." "A strategic match," Maren repeated slowly, "meaning someone from another powerful pack. Meaning someone whose family brings alliances, resources, protection," Greta said. "Love is a luxury most Alpha rulers are not permitted to indulge, not according to men like Councilman Everett, who has pushed for a match with the Ashgrove pack for over a year now." Maren absorbed this information carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she had learned. She had not asked to be drawn into pack politics, had not asked for any of this, and yet here she stood, apparently at the center of tensions she barely understood. That afternoon, she encountered Councilman Everett for the first time, a lean, sharp-eyed man who intercepted her in the main hallway, with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, through charm alone. "Miss Ashworth," he said, using her surname with a formality that felt more like a warning than a courtesy, "I trust you're settling in comfortably." "As comfortably as one can, given the circumstances," Maren replied carefully. "Of course." His smile did not waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "I imagine this must all feel rather overwhelming. A woman of your background suddenly thrust into the affairs of a pack as significant as ours. I do hope you understand the weight of the position the Alpha King occupies, and the importance of him making choices that serve the pack's future, rather than choices born from momentary sentiment." Maren held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see how his words landed. "I understand a great deal about weight, Councilman. I've carried quite a bit of it myself these past few days." Something flickered across Everett's face, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, though it vanished quickly behind his composed exterior. "Indeed," he said. "Well, I shan't keep you. Enjoy your afternoon." He walked away without waiting for a response, and Maren stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The conversation had contained no direct threats, no open hostility, and yet she understood clearly that Everett considered her an obstacle, one he intended to remove eventually, through whatever means proved necessary. She found Draven later that evening in his study, poring over documents spread across his desk, and though she had not planned to mention the conversation with Everett, something in his tired expression made her decide he deserved to know. "Councilman Everett spoke with me today," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "He seemed very concerned about your future choices." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing overtly threatening," Marin said. "Just enough to make his position clear. He wants you matched with someone from the Ashgrove pack. He considers me a complication." Draven set down the papers he had been holding and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with obvious exhaustion. "Everett has wanted an Ashgrove alliance for over a year. Their territory borders ours to the north, and their pack controls trade routes that would benefit us significantly if secured through marriage rather than negotiation." "And what do you want?" Marin asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Draven looked up at her, his expression suddenly unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "I want what any reasonable alpha wants. A strong pack, secure borders, a future built on more than temporary alliances. But I also refuse to pretend that duty erases everything else a person might feel." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared to address directly. Marin looked away first, unwilling to examine too closely what his statement might mean, unwilling to admit that some part of her had wanted him to say exactly that. "I should let you get back to your work," she said, turning toward the door. "Marin." His voice stopped her before she could leave. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite name. "Everett's concerns are not yours to carry. Whatever decisions I make regarding alliances or marriages will be mine alone, made with the pack's best interests in mind, not made because a councilman feels threatened by your presence here. But they will affect me regardless," she said quietly. "Won't they?" He did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than words could have. Over the following weeks, Marin settled further into the rhythms of fortress life, though the tension surrounding Everett's ambitions never fully disappeared. She began spending time in the training yard, watching the pack warriors practice, and eventually found herself drawn into conversation with a young woman named Fiona, one of the few female warriors within the Voss pack, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh despite the seriousness of her training. "You've got good instincts," Fiona told her one afternoon, after Marin had spent an hour watching the sparring matches with obvious interest. "Most newcomers flinch every time someone gets knocked down. You just study the footwork." "My old pack wasn't much for training women," Marin admitted, "but I always paid attention when I could." "Well, if you ever want actual instruction instead of just watching, my offer stands," Fiona said, grinning. "Never hurts to know how to defend yourself, especially around here, with all this council nonsense stirring up." Marin accepted the offer eagerly, and over the following days, Fiona began teaching her basic self-defense techniques during quiet hours when the training yard was mostly empty. The physical exertion helped clear her mind, gave her something concrete to focus on beyond the constant swirl of uncertainty surrounding her future. It was during one of these sessions that word arrived of a disturbance at the northern border, a small group of Ashgrove scouts caught crossing into Voss territory without permission. The Draven left immediately to address the situation personally, and Marin found herself unexpectedly anxious throughout his absence, a feeling she did not fully understand and was not entirely prepared to examine. He returned 2 days later, tired but unharmed, and sought her out that same evening in the garden where they had first spoken together weeks earlier. "The Ashgrove pack claims the scouts were simply lost," Draven said, settling onto the stone bench beside her. "I suspect otherwise. I believe Everett may have invited them closer than official channels would suggest, hoping to force circumstances that would push me toward the alliance he wants." "Can he do that?" Marin asked, alarmed. "Act against your wishes so openly?" "Councilman Everett has served this pack for over 20 years, Draven said. "He has allies among the older families who remember his father's service before him. I cannot simply remove him without cause, not without risking division within the pack itself." Marin considered this carefully. "So what happens now?" "Now," Draven said, turning to look at her directly, "I continue doing what I believe is right, regardless of the pressure surrounding me. And I would ask the same of you, Marin. Don't let Everett's maneuvering push you into believing you don't belong here." Something in his voice, steady and certain, settled the anxious knot that had formed in Marin's chest since his departure. She looked at him for a long moment, aware of how much had shifted in the weeks since her arrival, aware that the fear which once defined her every waking thought had slowly, carefully, begun to make room for something else entirely. "I won't," she said finally. Let him push me out, I mean. Draven's expression softened into something close to relief. Good, he said quietly. Because I find myself, against every reasonable expectation I once held for my own future, rather hoping you'll stay. The garden remained quiet around them, the flowers his mother had once tended swaying gently in the evening breeze, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, content simply to sit together beneath the darkening sky, each aware that whatever waited ahead would require more courage than either had yet been asked to summon. The letter arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a messenger who refused to identify himself beyond stating that the message came from Thornwood territory. Maren recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, and her stomach turned cold before she had even broken the seal. Her father's letter was brief, almost businesslike in tone, as though he were writing to a distant associate rather than his own daughter. He explained that circumstances had changed, that the debt he had settled through her placement with the Voss pack had apparently not accounted for certain additional losses discovered afterward, and that he intended to travel to Voss territory personally to discuss terms for additional compensation. Maren read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its meaning settled over her. He was not coming to apologize. He was not coming to check on her well-being after selling her to strangers. He was coming because he believed there was more profit to be extracted from the arrangement, more value to be squeezed from a daughter he had already proven willing to sacrifice once. She found Draven in the council chamber, deep in discussion with several advisors, and though she hesitated to interrupt, the urgency of the letter pushed her forward anyway. He looked up as she entered, immediately recognizing the distress on her face, and excused himself from the meeting without hesitation. "What's happened?" he asked, guiding her into a quieter side room. She handed him the letter wordlessly, watching his expression darken as he read through it. When he finished, his jaw was tight with barely controlled anger. "He wants more," Draven said flatly. "After everything, he actually believes he's entitled to more." "I should have expected this," Maren said, her voice tight with a mixture of humiliation and fury. "I was foolish to think the debt would simply end things between us." "You were not foolish," Draven said firmly. "You trusted that even a man capable of selling his own daughter might still possess some limit to his greed. That failure belongs entirely to him, not to you." Her father arrived 3 days later, accompanied by 2 men Maren did not recognize, likely hired for the journey rather than members of his actual pack. She watched from an upstairs window as his familiar figure crossed the courtyard, feeling a strange, hollow sensation settle into her chest, grief for a relationship that had clearly meant far less to him than she had once believed. Draven received him in the main hall, formal and cold, none of the warmth Maren had grown accustomed to seeing from him present in his expression now. Maren stood slightly behind him, close enough to hear the conversation but positioned carefully to avoid appearing as though she required his protection, even though some part of her was grateful for his presence nonetheless. "Alpha Voss," her father began, his tone carrying the false pleasantness of a man attempting to negotiate from a position weaker than he wanted to admit. "Thank you for receiving me. I understand the original arrangement between our packs, but certain complications have arisen regarding the full scope of debts owed, and I believe additional compensation may be warranted given these new circumstances." "Which complications exactly?" Draven asked, his voice dangerously calm. Her father hesitated, clearly having expected an easier audience. "There were additional creditors involved in the original arrangement, ones I failed to account for properly at the time. Settling those debts would require further assistance from your pack, given the value my daughter has already provided." "The value your daughter has provided," Draven repeated slowly, his voice carrying an edge that made even Maren's father take an involuntary step backward. "Your daughter is not a resource to be mined for continued profit, Ashworth. The debt was settled in full when she arrived here. There will be no further payment." "Now, see here," her father began, his composure cracking slightly. "The arrangement was quite clear that—" "The arrangement," Draven interrupted, "was that you would sign away your daughter's future, in exchange for the clearing of a debt you created through your own poor decisions. I honored that arrangement, distasteful as I found it, because your daughter deserved better than to suffer for a promise broken, but I will not honor further extortion disguised as negotiation." Maren's father's face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I am still her father," he said, his voice rising. "I still have rights regarding—" "You forfeited any claim to rights the moment you sold her like property," Draven said, his voice now cold enough to silence the room entirely. "You will return to Thornwood territory today, and you will not return here again unless specifically invited, which I assure you is unlikely to happen in your lifetime." Her father's mouth opened and closed several times, clearly searching for some argument that might salvage the situation, but nothing came. Maren watched him deflate slightly under Draven's unwavering gaze, watched the man who had once commanded her entire childhood suddenly appear small and diminished in the face of true authority. Before he could attempt another argument, Maren stepped forward, drawing both men's attention. "Father," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever fear or desperation drove you to sell me, I might have found a way to forgive eventually, given enough time, but this, coming here to extract more from a debt already settled, treating me as though my worth exists only in what profit I generate for you, this I will never forgive." Her father's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine shame, quickly buried beneath his wounded pride. "You don't understand the pressures I faced," he said weakly. "I understand perfectly," Maren said. "I understand that when faced with difficulty, you chose to sacrifice your own daughter rather than find another solution. I understand that even now, faced with the consequences of that choice, your first instinct is to seek further profit rather than seek forgiveness. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you truly are." The room fell silent, her father standing frozen, clearly unprepared for the strength in her voice, the composure she had somehow found despite everything he had put her through. "Leave," Draven said finally, his voice brooking no argument. "Now, before my patience for this conversation expires entirely." Her father left without another word, his two hired men following silently behind him, and Maren watched through the window as they departed the courtyard, disappearing back down the long driveway toward the iron gates and the world beyond. When she turned back, she found Draven watching her with an expression of quiet admiration. "You didn't need me to stand up for you," he said softly. "You handled that entirely on your own." "I needed you to remove the threat of extortion," Maren said honestly. "But the words, those were mine to say." "They were well said," Draven replied. "Better than well said. You spoke with more strength in that moment than most warriors I've trained with for years." Maren felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, an acknowledgement of her own resilience that felt more meaningful coming from him than she expected. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not letting him manipulate the situation further." "I would do considerably more than that for you," Draven said, then seemed to catch himself, as though realizing how much the statement revealed. He cleared his throat, looking briefly uncertain in a way that felt endearing rather than weak. "That is, I mean to say, protecting members of my household is simply my responsibility as Alpha." Maren allowed herself a small smile at his sudden formality. "Of course," she said, "simply your responsibility." Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but clearly understood by both, a recognition that whatever existed between them had grown beyond the boundaries of simple obligation or debt. Neither of them addressed it directly, not yet, but the awareness lingered in the air between them long after the conversation ended, quiet and undeniable, waiting patiently for the moment when one of them would finally find the courage to name it. That night, alone in her room, Maren thought about her father's face as he left the fortress, small and defeated, stripped of whatever power he once held over her life. She had expected to feel triumphant, or perhaps simply relieved. Instead, she felt something closer to peace, a quiet acceptance that the family she had known was gone, replaced by uncertainty, yes, but also by the possibility of something entirely new, something she was only beginning to allow herself to hope for. Autumn settled fully over Voss territory in the weeks that followed, painting the surrounding forest in shades of amber and rust, and with the changing season, came a shift in Maren's daily life that she could not have predicted when she first arrived at the fortress gates. She had begun assisting Greta with household matters, not out of obligation but out of genuine interest, and had continued her training sessions with Fiona, growing steadily more confident in her ability to defend herself should the need ever arise. Draven sought her out more frequently now, finding reasons to walk with her through the garden in the evenings, to share meals that stretched longer than necessary, filled with conversation that ranged from pack history to personal memories neither of them had shared with anyone else in years. Maren found herself looking forward to these moments more than she was entirely comfortable admitting, even to herself. It was during one such evening, as they walked slowly through the garden while the last light of day faded behind the fortress walls, that Draven finally spoke the words that had clearly been building between them for weeks. "I need to tell you something," he said, stopping beside the same stone bench where they had first spoken honestly with each other. "Something I should have said more clearly before now." Maren turned to face him, her heart beginning to beat faster despite her attempts to remain composed. "All right," she said carefully. "The dreams I told you about when you first arrived," Draven began, "I described them as simple visions, images that appeared while I slept, But I did not tell you everything about what those dreams meant to me, or how deeply they affected my understanding of what I was searching for, even before I knew I was searching at all." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Maren waited patiently, sensing that whatever he intended to say required careful consideration on his part. "For 3 years, I dreamed of a woman I could not name, could not fully see, and yet somehow understood, on a level deeper than simple recognition," he continued. "I told myself these dreams meant nothing, that they were simply the product of an overactive imagination, or perhaps loneliness, given the pressures of leading this pack, without the companionship most people take for granted. But you didn't believe that," Maren said quietly, understanding somehow where his explanation was heading. "No," Draven admitted, "I didn't believe it, not truly. Some instinct told me these dreams meant something significant, that the woman appearing in them existed somewhere in the world, waiting to be found, though I had no idea how such a search might even begin." "And then I arrived," Maren said. "And then you arrived," Draven confirmed, his voice softening, carrying the exact scar I had seen countless times in my dreams, delivered to my doorstep not through any search I conducted myself, but through circumstances entirely beyond my control. "I have spent every day since questioning what that means, Maren, questioning whether what I feel toward you stems from genuine connection, or simply from years of anticipation finally finding a face to attach itself to." Maren considered his words carefully, understanding the vulnerability required to share such uncertainty aloud. "And what have you concluded?" she asked. "That it doesn't matter how these feelings began," Draven said, his eyes steady on hers. "What matters is that every conversation we've shared since your arrival has only deepened what I feel, has only confirmed that whatever drew us together, dreams or fate or simple chance, the connection itself is real, and growing stronger each day, regardless of its origins." Maren's breath caught slightly at the directness of his admission. She had felt the same growing warmth between them over the past weeks, had noticed her own thoughts turning toward him more frequently than she expected, had found herself anticipating their conversations with an eagerness that surprised her given everything that had brought her to this place. But hearing him name it so clearly, so honestly, made the reality of it impossible to ignore any longer. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly, "though I've spent considerable effort trying to convince myself otherwise, given everything that happened before I arrived here." "What do you mean?" Draven asked gently. "My father taught me, without meaning to, that trusting someone completely leaves you vulnerable to betrayal," Maren said, her voice carrying old pain she had not fully examined until this moment. "I've spent weeks telling myself that whatever I feel toward you must be caution, gratitude perhaps, anything other than genuine affection, because affection requires trust, and trust has not served me particularly well in my life so far." Draven reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, and gently took her hand in his. "I cannot promise you a life free from pain," he said honestly. "No one can offer that kind of guarantee, regardless of how deeply they care, but I can promise you that whatever happens between us, I will never treat you as something to be used or sold or discarded when convenient. You deserve someone who sees your full worth, Maren, not someone who sees only what value you might provide." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Maren's eyes, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of his words. When she finally found her voice again, it emerged softer than she intended. "I want to believe that," she said. "I want to allow myself to trust what's growing between us. But I'm frightened, Draven. Frightened of what it might cost me if I'm wrong about you." "Then take whatever time you need," Draven said. "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight, or even this week. I am only asking you to know that my feelings toward you are genuine, and that I will wait as long as necessary for you to feel safe enough to trust them fully." They stood together in the darkening garden, hands still joined, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally given voice, and Maren felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight, protective grip she had held over her own heart since the night her father's betrayal first shattered her sense of safety in the world. "There's something else," Draven said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them. "Councilman Everett requested a formal council meeting for next week. He intends to press again for the Ashgrove Alliance, and I suspect he will use your presence here as his primary argument against my judgment." Maren felt a flicker of the old anxiety return. "What will you say to him?" "I will say what I've told you already," Draven replied firmly. "That my choices regarding marriage and alliance are mine to make, guided by what serves this pack's genuine well-being rather than by political convenience alone. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Everett may attempt to make things difficult for you directly, given that reasoned argument has failed to sway me thus far." "I'm not afraid of Councilman Everett," Marin said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the statement was entirely true. Draven smiled at her certainty, pride evident in his expression. "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine you are." They remained in the garden until full darkness settled over the fortress, reluctant to end a conversation that had shifted something fundamental between them. And when they finally parted ways for the evening, Marin returned to her room feeling lighter than she had felt in longer than she could remember, the weight of old fears beginning, slowly and carefully, to loosen their grip upon her heart. She lay awake for some time that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Draven had spoken in the garden, testing the feeling of hope against the caution that had protected her for so long. For the first time since arriving at the fortress, she allowed herself to imagine a future here, not simply as a woman fulfilling her father's debt, but as someone building a genuine life, perhaps even genuine love, with a man who had proven, through action rather than empty words, that he saw her as far more than a payment settled or an obligation fulfilled. Whatever challenges awaited them, the confrontation with Everett, the pressures of pack politics, the lingering uncertainty about what fate or dreams truly meant for their future together, Marin felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely ready to face them. The council chamber was already full when Marin arrived, standing quietly near the back of the room at Draven's request, close enough to hear every word, but positioned to avoid becoming the immediate focus of the assembled advisors. Councilman Everett sat near the head of the long table, flanked by two other senior council members whose names Marin had learned, but whose loyalties she still did not fully understand. Draven took his seat at the head of the table, his posture radiating the calm authority Marin had come to associate with him, though she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed his awareness of the difficult conversation ahead. "Let us begin," Draven said, addressing the assembled council. "Councilman Everett, I understand you requested this meeting to discuss matters of alliance." "Indeed, Alpha Voss," Everett said, rising slightly from his chair, his tone carrying the practiced smoothness of a man well accustomed to political maneuvering. "As you know, the Ashgrove Pack has expressed continued interest in formalizing an alliance through marriage, an arrangement that would secure our northern trade routes and strengthen our territorial defenses considerably. An arrangement you have raised numerous times over the past year," Draven acknowledged. "My position on the matter remains unchanged. I will not enter into marriage as a purely political transaction." "With respect," Everett continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward Marin before returning to Draven, "circumstances have shifted somewhat since your position was last stated so firmly. The presence of an outside woman within your household, one arriving through debt settlement rather than genuine alliance, raises questions among the council regarding your judgment on matters of succession and pack stability." Several other council members murmured in agreement, and Marin felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give Everett the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "Miss Ashworth's presence here has nothing to do with matters of succession," Draven said firmly. "She arrived as settlement of a debt owed by her father, nothing more. Any further developments regarding her place within this household remain entirely separate from questions of political alliance." "And yet," Everett pressed, "the council has observed your increased attention toward her over these past weeks. Walks in the garden, extended meals, private conversations that extend well beyond what circumstances would strictly require. Forgive my bluntness, Alpha Voss, but the pack deserves clarity regarding your intentions, particularly given the strategic importance of securing proper alliance before winter settles fully upon us." The room fell silent, every eye turning toward Draven, awaiting his response. Marin held her breath, uncertain how he intended to address such a direct challenge in front of the full council. "Very well," Draven said finally, his voice carrying a steadiness that seemed to settle the room despite the tension still hanging thick in the air. "Since clarity is what the council desires, I will provide it. My growing regard for Miss Ashworth is genuine, and I do not intend to apologize for feelings that have developed honestly, regardless of the unconventional circumstances that first brought her into this household." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the assembled council members. Everett's expression tightened, clearly having expected a more diplomatic dodge rather than open acknowledgement. "Alpha Voss," Everett said carefully, "surely you understand the risk such a declaration poses. An alliance built on genuine affection may satisfy personal desire, but it offers this pack none of the strategic protections that a properly negotiated marriage would provide." "I understand the risk perfectly well," Draven replied. "I also understand that this pack has survived numerous challenges throughout its history, through strength, unity, and the loyalty of its people, not solely through carefully calculated marriages designed to placate neighboring territories. The Ash Grove alliance you propose offers trade advantages, certainly, but it does not guarantee the kind of genuine partnership that strengthens a pack from within. Sentiment, Everett said, his composure beginning to crack slightly, does not defend our borders, Alpha Voss. No, Draven agreed, but a leader who governs from a place of genuine conviction, rather than one manipulated by fear of political consequence, defends this pack far better than one who sacrifices his own judgment for the sake of appeasing a councilman's preferred strategy. The words landed heavily in the silent chamber, and Merrin watched Everett's face flush with barely controlled anger, though he said nothing further, apparently recognizing that continued argument would only diminish his standing further in front of the assembled council. I would remind the council, Draven continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled advisors, that final decisions regarding my personal alliances rest with me alone, as they always have throughout this pack's history. I welcome counsel on matters of trade, defense, and territorial negotiation. I do not welcome interference in matters of the heart, regardless of how strategically convenient such interference might appear. Several council members nodded slowly, clearly persuaded, or at least unwilling to openly challenge their alpha's clear stance on the matter. Everett remained silent, his jaw tight, though he offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement before finally speaking again. Of course, Alpha Voss, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The council defers to your judgment, as always. The meeting concluded shortly after, the council members filing out of the chamber in small groups, murmuring quietly among themselves. Merrin remained behind as the room emptied, watching Draven carefully as he gathered the documents spread across the table before him. That was risky, she said finally, once they were alone. Declaring your feelings so openly, in front of the entire council. Perhaps, Draven admitted, but hiding them would have accomplished nothing, beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation. Everett would have continued pressing the issue regardless, and I would rather face his challenges directly than allow uncertainty to fester beneath the surface. And if the council had turned against you? Merrin asked. If they had sided fully with Everett's position? Draven considered the question seriously. Then I would have faced that challenge as it arose, but I did not become Alpha King by allowing fear of consequence to dictate my choices, Merrin. I do not intend to start now, particularly not regarding something as important as this. Merrin felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though the lingering tension of the confrontation with Everett still weighed on her mind. He won't stop trying, will he? Everett, I mean. No, Draven admitted. I doubt he will abandon his efforts entirely. Men like Everett rarely accept defeat gracefully, particularly when their sense of strategic control feels threatened. We should remain cautious moving forward, watchful for whatever approach he attempts next. I'm not afraid of watchfulness, Merrin said. I've spent most of my life being watchful. It's trusting that I've had to learn. Draven reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. And do you trust this? He asked quietly. What's growing between us? Merrin considered the question carefully, weighing everything that had happened since her arrival, the betrayal of her father, the unexpected kindness of a man who owed her nothing, the slow, careful building of something genuine, amid circumstances that could have easily become something far darker. Yes, she said finally, with more certainty than she had expected to feel. I trust it. I trust you. The words settled between them, simple but profound, and Draven's expression softened into something close to relief, as though he had been carrying uncertainty of his own regarding her feelings, despite everything they had already shared together in recent weeks. Then whatever Everett attempts next, Draven said, we face it together. Merrin nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle firmly into her chest, alongside a determination she had not expected to find so completely within herself. Whatever challenges the coming weeks might bring, whatever political maneuvering Everett continued to attempt, she found herself ready to face it, not as a helpless debt payment delivered against her will, but as a woman who had chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, to build something real within walls that had once felt like nothing more than an elaborate prison. The fortress no longer felt like captivity. It felt, increasingly, like the beginning of a home she had never expected to find. The scream tore through the fortress just after midnight, sharp enough to wake half the household, and Merrin was on her feet before she fully understood what had pulled her from sleep. She threw open her door to find pack members already rushing through the corridors, their faces tight with alarm, moving toward the northern watchtower where the sound had originated. She followed, her heart pounding, ignoring Greta's attempt to pull her back toward the safety of her room. Whatever had happened, she needed to know, needed to be certain Draven was safe, a need so immediate and overwhelming that it startled her with its intensity. She found him in the courtyard, already dressed and armed, directing a group of warriors toward the northern boundary of the territory. His expression, when he noticed her approaching, shifted briefly with concern, before settling into the focused calm of a leader managing a crisis. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "We've had reports of an intrusion along the northern border. Until we understand the full situation, I need you somewhere safe." "What kind of intrusion?" Merrin asked, refusing to retreat despite his instruction. "Armed men, moving through the forest boundary," Draven said. "Possibly Ashgrove scouts, though the pattern of movement suggests something more organized than simple border testing." Fear coiled tight in Merrin's stomach, though she forced herself to remain composed. "Let me help," she said. "I've been training with Fiona. I'm not as helpless as you might assume." "I know you're not helpless," Draven said, his voice softening slightly despite the urgency of the situation. "But I need to focus on securing the border, and I cannot do that effectively while worrying about your safety in the middle of an active threat. Please, Merrin, trust me on this." She hesitated, torn between her desire to prove her own capability and her recognition that arguing further would only distract him from the more pressing crisis at hand. Finally, she nodded, stepping back. "Be careful," she said quietly. Draven's expression softened further, and he reached out briefly to touch her cheek, a gesture that felt both tender and urgent given the circumstances surrounding them. "Always," he said, before turning and disappearing into the darkness with his assembled warriors. The hours that followed felt endless. Merrin remained in the main hall alongside Greta and several other household members, all of them too anxious to retreat fully to their own quarters, listening for any sound that might indicate what was happening at the border. Word arrived periodically through runners, fragmented reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Confirmation that armed intruders had indeed crossed into Voss territory, that a confrontation was underway near the northern watchtower. Dawn was breaking when Draven finally returned, exhausted but uninjured, along with most of his warriors. Merrin rushed to meet him the moment he entered the courtyard, relief flooding through her so completely that she nearly forgot the careful composure she usually maintained in front of the household staff. "You're safe," she said, her voice unsteady with the release of hours of accumulated fear. "I'm safe," Draven confirmed, catching her hands in his own. "The intruders were driven back across the border. We captured 2 of them for questioning." "Ashgrove scouts?" Merrin asked. Draven's expression darkened. "Mercenaries, actually. Hired men, carrying no official markings from any pack." But one of them, before he stopped talking entirely, mentioned receiving payment through an intermediary connected to Councilman Everett. Merrin's breath caught. "Everett arranged this? An actual attack on the territory?" "I cannot confirm it fully, not yet," Draven said carefully. "The mercenary's statement could be misdirection, an attempt to sow discord within my own council, rather than genuine evidence of Everett's involvement. But given his recent behavior, given how directly he challenged me during the council meeting, I cannot rule out the possibility either." "What will you do?" Merrin asked. "Investigate thoroughly, before taking any action," Draven said. "Accusing a council member of arranging an attack on pack territory is not something I can do without absolute certainty, but I intend to discover the truth, regardless of how long that investigation takes." Over the following days, Draven's most trusted advisors conducted a careful, discreet investigation into the attack, tracing the mercenaries' movements, questioning anyone who might have information regarding who arranged their crossing into Voss territory. Merrin watched the process unfold with growing unease, aware that whatever truth eventually surfaced would likely fracture the council irreparably, regardless of the outcome. The evidence, when it finally came together, was damning. Financial records obtained through careful investigation confirmed payments made to the mercenary group, traced back through several intermediaries to accounts controlled by Councilman Everett himself. The intent, it seemed, had never been to seriously threaten the fortress, but rather to create a crisis significant enough to demonstrate that Draven's judgment, distracted by his growing feelings for an outsider, had left the pack vulnerable to attack. "He wanted to prove a point," Draven said grimly, once the evidence had been fully assembled and confirmed. "He wanted to demonstrate that my attention toward you had compromised my ability to properly defend this territory, hoping the resulting fear among the council would force me toward the Ashgrove alliance regardless of my own wishes." "He risked actual lives to make his argument," Merrin said, horrified by the calculated coldness of such a plan. "Yes," Draven said, "and that recklessness, more than anything else, confirms he no longer serves this pack's genuine interests, only his own ambition for maintaining influence over its direction." Everett was summoned before the full council 2 days later, confronted with the evidence assembled against him. He attempted denial initially, then shifted to justification, arguing that his actions, however extreme, had been intended to protect the pack from what he perceived as dangerous distraction on Draven's part. "You endangered innocent lives," Draven said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that silenced the entire chamber. "You arranged an armed intrusion into this territory, risking the safety of warriors and household members alike, all to manufacture a crisis serving your own political ambitions. There is no justification sufficient to excuse such a betrayal of your position." The council voted unanimously to strip Everett of his position, exiling him from Voss territory entirely, a punishment that reflected the severity of his actions while avoiding the harsher consequences that some council members had initially argued for. Merrin watched the proceedings with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, aware that the threat Everett represented had finally been resolved, but equally aware of how close the situation had come to genuine tragedy. That evening she found Draven alone in his study, the weight of the day's events still visible in the tension across his shoulders. She approached quietly, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for invitation. "It's over," she said softly. "Everett is gone." "For now," Draven said, though his voice carried more weariness than triumph. "I suspect this will not be the last challenge we face, regarding our future together. But this particular threat, at least, has been resolved. I'm sorry," Merrin said quietly, "that my presence here caused such division within your council." "Don't apologize for that," Draven said firmly, meeting her eyes directly. Everett's actions were his own choice, born from his own ambition and unwillingness to accept judgment he disagreed with. You did nothing wrong, Merrin. You simply existed and chose to build something genuine with me, and that should never require apology. Merrin felt the truth of his words settle over her slowly, easing some of the guilt she had carried since learning of Everett's betrayal. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that, for believing it." "I believe it completely," Draven said, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "Whatever comes next, Merrin, know that I do not regret a single moment of what has grown between us, regardless of the complications it has created along the way." Outside the study window, the fortress settled into the quiet stillness of evening. The immediate crisis resolved, but the underlying tensions of pack politics and personal uncertainty still lingering beneath the surface, waiting patiently for whatever challenge might arise next in the ongoing story of two people who had found each other, through circumstances neither could have predicted, and who now found themselves determined to protect what they had built together, regardless of the cost required to do so. Winter arrived quickly after Everett's exile, blanketing the fortress grounds in thick snow that transformed the familiar courtyard into something almost unrecognizable, soft and quiet beneath a layer of white that muffled every sound. Merrin found herself standing at her window often during those early winter mornings, watching the snow fall steadily, feeling a strange sense of peace that would have seemed impossible to imagine during her first frightened night in this place. The pack had settled considerably since the council's decision regarding Everett, the remaining council members proving far more receptive to Draven's leadership without the constant undermining influence that had complicated matters for so long. Merrin had grown more comfortable in her role within the household, no longer simply a debt settlement tolerated by circumstance, but a genuine presence within the fortress community, respected by staff and warriors alike for the strength and grace with which she had navigated her unexpected arrival. It was during a quiet evening in early winter that news arrived which threatened to disrupt the fragile peace they had built. A messenger arrived from Ashgrove territory, requesting formal audience with Draven regarding matters of continued alliance interest, apparently unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the resolution of the Everett situation and its implications for any strategic marriage discussion. Draven received the Ashgrove representative in the main hall, Merrin standing quietly nearby, having grown confident enough in her position within the household to remain present for such discussions without feeling the need to hide or retreat. Alpha Voss, the Ashgrove representative began, a composed woman named Delphine who served as advisor to the Ashgrove pack leader. "I understand recent developments within your council have created some uncertainty regarding future alliance discussions. My Alpha wished me to convey that the Ashgrove pack remains open to formalizing our relationship through appropriate marriage arrangement, despite whatever personal complications may have arisen. I appreciate the Ashgrove pack's continued interest in trade cooperation," Draven said carefully. "However, I must clarify, as I did during recent council discussions, that I do not intend to pursue marriage as a purely strategic arrangement. My personal circumstances have developed in a direction that precludes such consideration." Delphine's expression remained carefully neutral, though Merrin noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested genuine surprise at such direct refusal. "I see," she said. "May I ask what circumstances you refer to, Alpha Voss?" Draven glanced briefly toward Merrin before answering, a small gesture that spoke volumes despite its subtlety. "I have found genuine partnership within my own household," he said simply. "One that I do not intend to set aside for the sake of political convenience, regardless of the trade advantages such an alliance might theoretically provide." Delphine's gaze moved toward Marin with obvious curiosity, studying her with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats to established plans. "I understand," she said finally, her tone carrying grudging acceptance rather than open hostility. "I will convey your position to my alpha. Though I suspect trade negotiations between our packs may require additional consideration, given the shift in circumstances, I remain entirely open to continued trade cooperation through traditional negotiation," Draven assured her. "The absence of marriage alliance need not preclude mutually beneficial arrangements between our territories." The conversation concluded on relatively amicable terms, though Marin sensed the underlying tension that remained, an acknowledgement that Draven's choice, however genuine and well-considered, carried real consequences for the pack's broader strategic position. Once Delphine had departed, Marin turned to Draven with lingering concern. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, refusing the Ashgrove alliance so definitively. The trade benefits alone seemed significant, based on everything Everett argued during the council meeting. "I am certain," Draven said, his voice carrying no hesitation whatsoever. "Whatever trade advantages an Ashgrove alliance might provide, they pale in comparison to what I would sacrifice by pursuing marriage without genuine connection. I have seen enough of political marriages within neighboring packs, Marin, enough hollow partnerships maintained purely for strategic convenience, to know I want something different for my own life." "But the pack's security," Marin pressed. "Doesn't that matter more than personal happiness?" Draven took her hands gently in his expression serious. "A pack's true security comes from unity, from a leader whose judgment remains clear and uncompromised by resentment or hollow obligation. I would make a poor alpha indeed if I sacrificed my own integrity for temporary trade benefits, only to govern afterward from a place of quiet resentment toward a marriage I never genuinely wanted." Marin considered his words carefully, understanding the wisdom behind them, even as she recognized the sacrifice his choice represented. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing this, for choosing us, despite everything it might cost." "There was never truly a choice to make," Draven said simply. "Not once I understood what I felt toward you. Everything else has simply been finding the courage to act according to that understanding, regardless of the political complications involved." As winter deepened around the fortress, their relationship continued to grow steadily stronger, built not on the foundation of dreams alone. Though those strange prophetic visions remained an unexplained mystery neither of them had fully unraveled, but on the accumulated trust of countless conversations, shared burdens, and mutual respect earned through action, rather than simply assumed through circumstance. Fiona, ever perceptive despite her rough exterior, commented on the shift during one of their training sessions in the covered arena that protected against the worst of the winter weather. "You've changed since you first arrived," Fiona observed, watching Marin execute a defensive maneuver with considerably more confidence than she had shown during her earliest lessons. "Not just your fighting. Everything about you seems steadier now." "I suppose I finally feel like I belong somewhere," Marin admitted, pausing to catch her breath after the exercise. "For a long time I wasn't certain that feeling was possible for me anymore, given everything that happened before I came here." "Your father, you mean?" Fiona said carefully. "Among other things," Marin said. "But yes, mostly that. Learning that the people meant to protect you can betray you so completely, it changes how you see everything afterward. I spent weeks after arriving here waiting for the same betrayal to happen again, certain that kindness always carried some hidden cost. And now?" Fiona asked. Marin considered the question seriously before answering. "Now I understand that not every kindness is a trap. Some people genuinely mean what they say, genuinely act according to their words rather than hidden agendas. It's taken time to trust that fully, but I believe it now, more than I've believed anything in a very long while." Fiona smiled, genuine warmth evident in her expression. "Good," she said, "because for what it's worth, the whole household has noticed how much happier the Alpha seems since your arrival. Whatever strange fate brought you here, I think most of us are grateful for it, Everett's foolishness aside." The winter months continued in relative peace, the pack settling comfortably into the rhythms of the cold season. Marin finding genuine contentment in the life she had built within walls that had once felt like nothing more than an elaborate prison. She had come to know every member of the household staff, had developed genuine friendships among the pack warriors, had learned the history and traditions of a territory that increasingly felt like home, rather than simply a place of temporary residence. And through it all, Her relationship with Draven continued to deepen. Each conversation, each shared silence, each quiet moment in the garden building, steadily towards something neither of them had explicitly named yet, though both understood, without needing words to confirm it, exactly where their path together was heading. The first thaw of early spring brought with it a visitor Maren had not expected to see again, though she had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this particular confrontation remained unfinished. Her mother arrived at the fortress gates alone, without escort, carrying only a small travel bag, and an expression of exhaustion that suggested a long and difficult journey. Maren received the news of her mother's arrival with a complicated mixture of emotions, surprise chief among them, followed closely by wariness born from everything her family had already put her through. She found her mother waiting in the smaller sitting room near the main hall, looking smaller and more fragile than Maren remembered from the night everything had changed. "Maren," her mother said, rising quickly from her seat, her voice trembling slightly. "I wasn't certain you would agree to see me." "I nearly didn't," Maren admitted honestly, remaining near the doorway rather than approaching further. "What are you doing here?" Her mother's composure wavered, tears gathering quickly in her eyes. "I left him," she said. "Your father. After what he tried to do here, demanding more from a debt already settled, I could no longer stay silent about everything I've watched him do over the years. I should have spoken up long before now, should have protected you the night those men came for you, but I was afraid, Maren. Afraid of what speaking against him might cost me." Maren studied her mother's face carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation, any indication that this confession served some hidden purpose beyond genuine remorse. She found only exhaustion and grief, emotions that felt too raw to be entirely calculated. "You said nothing that night," Maren said quietly. "You stood on the stairs and watched them take me, and you said absolutely nothing." "I know," her mother said, her voice breaking. "I have relived that moment every single day since it happened, wondering why I remained silent, why fear held my tongue when my own daughter needed me to speak. There is no excuse sufficient to explain that failure, Maren. I only hope you might someday find it possible to forgive me, even if you cannot forget." Maren remained silent for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of her mother's words against the depth of the abandonment she had felt that night, and every night since, when she thought about how completely alone she had been in that terrible moment. "Where will you go now?" Maren asked finally. "Now that you've left him?" "I don't know," her mother admitted. "I have no resources of my own. No pack willing to take in a woman who abandoned her position within Thornwood territory. I came here because I had nowhere else to turn, and because I needed you to know, regardless of whether you choose to forgive me, that I finally found the courage your father never allowed me to find before." Draven arrived at the doorway during this exchange, having been informed of the unexpected visitor, and remained quietly at the threshold, allowing Maren space to navigate the conversation without interference, though his presence offered a quiet reassurance that she was not facing this difficult reunion entirely alone. "I cannot promise forgiveness," Maren said finally, turning back to her mother. "Not yet, perhaps not for a long while. What happened that night broke something in me that I'm still learning to repair. But I understand, better than I once did, how fear can paralyze a person, can prevent them from acting according to what they know is right." Her mother nodded, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I only hoped you might allow me the chance to eventually earn it, through actions rather than empty words." Maren glanced toward Draven, who offered a small, encouraging nod, leaving the decision entirely in her hands without attempting to influence her choice either direction. "You may stay," Maren said finally, turning back to her mother. "Not because I've forgiven what happened, but because I understand what it means to need somewhere safe when everything else has fallen apart. But know this, if you stay here, it will not be as my mother returning to reclaim what was lost. It will be as someone starting over, proving through time and action that the courage you found leaving Thornwood extends to genuinely changing how you engage with the world going forward." Her mother's expression flooded with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I understand completely, and I promise, Maren, I will not disappoint you again." Draven stepped forward then, addressing Maren's mother directly for the first time. "You may take rooms within the household staff quarters," he said. "Greta will help you settle in, and there will be work available should you wish to contribute to the household, rather than simply relying on charity." "Thank you, Alpha Voss," her mother said, bowing slightly with genuine gratitude. "I will not take this generosity lightly." As her mother was led away by a household attendant to begin settling into her new arrangements, Maren remained standing in the sitting room, processing the complicated whirlwind of emotions the reunion had stirred within her. Draven approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking immediately. simply offering his presence as support. Did I make the right choice? Maren asked finally, uncertainty evident in her voice. I believe you made a compassionate choice, Draven said carefully. Whether it proves to be the right one depends entirely on whether your mother follows through on the courage she claims to have found, but you offered her a chance to prove herself, without sacrificing your own boundaries or pretending the past didn't happen. That seems like wisdom to me, not weakness. I'm still angry with her, Maren admitted. For not speaking up that night, for years of silence before that night, for a lifetime of choosing peace with my father over protecting me from his worst decisions. That anger is entirely justified, Draven said, and you're allowed to hold it alongside whatever compassion you extend toward her now. The two are not mutually exclusive, Maren. Forgiveness, if it comes eventually, doesn't require erasing the legitimate pain that preceded it. Maren leaned into him slightly, grateful for his steady presence amid the emotional complexity of her mother's unexpected arrival. How did you become so wise about these things? She asked, a small smile finally breaking through her tension. Years of watching my own counsel navigate complicated grudges and alliances, I suppose, Draven said, a hint of humor entering his voice for the first time since the conversation began. Though I confess, most of what I understand about genuine forgiveness, I've learned from watching how you've navigated everything that's happened to you since arriving here. Maren looked up at him, warmth spreading through her chest despite the emotional exhaustion of the day. That's a generous assessment, she said. It's an honest one, Draven replied, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair away from her face. You've shown more strength and grace throughout this entire ordeal than most people could summon in a lifetime, Maren. Your mother's arrival, however complicated, doesn't change that truth. They remained together in the quiet sitting room, as evening settled over the fortress, the complicated reunion with her mother adding another layer to the ongoing story of healing and rebuilding that had defined Maren's life since her arrival at Voss territory. Whatever came next, whether her mother's promised transformation proved genuine, or whether old patterns eventually resurfaced, Maren found herself grateful, at least, for the chance to face this new challenge from a place of stability and support rather than isolation and fear. The spring thaw continued outside the fortress walls, snow melting steadily to reveal the green earth beneath, a quiet symbol of renewal that felt entirely appropriate given everything unfolding within the household during those transitional weeks. Change, Maren was learning, rarely arrived in the clean, simple forms found in old stories. It arrived messy, complicated, filled with unresolved tension alongside genuine hope, and perhaps that complexity was simply the honest texture of any life worth living fully. The Pack Accord gathering arrived with the full bloom of spring, an ancient tradition among the northern territories where neighboring packs assembled once each year to renew agreements, settle disputes, and witness formal declarations that would shape the coming seasons. Voss territory had been selected to host the gathering this year, and the fortress had transformed over the preceding weeks into something Maren barely recognized. Banners hung along every corridor, the great hall polished and prepared to receive representatives from packs across the entire region. Maren stood in her chambers on the morning of the formal ceremony, studying her reflection in the tall mirror Greta had helped position near the window, still adjusting to the elegant gown she wore, deep blue fabric that Draven had commissioned specifically for this occasion. A color he claimed matched perfectly the shade of the sky during their first conversation together in his mother's garden. You look radiant, Greta said, adjusting a final piece of Maren's hair with careful precision, though I suspect the Alpha King would say the same regardless of what you wore. Maren smiled, though nervousness fluttered persistently in her stomach. Do you think the other pack leaders will accept this? Accept me, standing beside him during such an important ceremony? I think, Greta said carefully, that acceptance from outside leaders matters considerably less than the acceptance you've already earned within this household. You've proven yourself here, Maren, through your own strength and character, not through any political maneuvering or strategic advantage. That is a foundation no outside opinion can shake. The words settled Maren's nerves slightly, and she took a final steadying breath before making her way toward the Great Hall, where representatives from a dozen neighboring packs had already gathered, along with the entire Voss household and warriors assembled for the historic occasion. Draven waited near the head of the hall, dressed formally in dark colors that emphasized his authority, and his expression softened visibly the moment he caught sight of her approaching through the crowd. He stepped forward to meet her, taking her hand gently as she reached his side. You look beautiful, he said quietly, for her ears alone. Though I confess, I've thought that about you since the very first night you arrived here, frightened and furious, in equal measure, refusing to let anyone see how much fear you carried beneath that composure. I remember that night vividly, Maren said softly, I never imagined it would lead to this moment. Nor did I, Draven admitted, though I suppose, given the dreams that first drew my attention toward you, some part of me always sensed something significant would eventually unfold between us. The formal proceedings began shortly after, various pack representatives rising to renew trade agreements, settle minor territorial disputes, and exchange the traditional gifts that marked the Accord's continuation for another year. Merrin watched with fascination, understanding more fully with each passing moment the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed the Northern Territories, relationships Draven navigated with the steady confidence she had come to associate with him. When the formal business concluded, Draven rose from his seat, addressing the assembled representatives directly, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. "Before we conclude this year's gathering," he said, "I wish to make a personal announcement, one I believe holds significance, not only for Voss territory, but for the broader understanding among our neighboring packs regarding how alliances might genuinely form." The hall quieted considerably, attention focused entirely on their Alpha King as he continued. "Many of you are aware of the circumstances that first brought Merrin Ashworth into this household, a debt settlement arranged without her consent, circumstances that could have easily resulted in tragedy, rather than the genuine partnership that has since developed between us." Draven turned to face Merrin directly, his expression open and unguarded in front of the entire assembled crowd. "I stand before you today not simply as Alpha King of Voss territory, but as a man deeply and genuinely in love with a woman who arrived here through betrayal, yet chose, through her own strength and grace, to build something real from circumstances that could have destroyed her entirely." Merrin felt tears gathering unexpectedly as he continued, the weight of his words landing with a significance that silenced every doubt she had carried throughout their relationship's development. "Merrin," Draven said, turning fully toward her now, taking both her hands in his own, "I do not ask you to become my Luna because tradition demands it, or because political convenience suggests it. I ask because every conversation we've shared, every challenge we've faced together, every quiet moment in my mother's garden has confirmed what I believe those 3 years of dreams were always trying to tell me. You are not simply someone fate delivered to my doorstep. You are the partner I choose, deliberately and completely, above any strategic alliance or political advantage this position might otherwise offer me." He knelt then, before the entire assembled crowd, producing a small ring crafted from silver and set with a stone the exact deep blue shade of her gown. "Will you accept not simply my hand, but my complete devotion, built on everything genuine we've discovered together, since that first frightened night you arrived here against your will?" Merrin looked down at him, tears now falling freely, overwhelmed by the completeness of the journey that had brought her to this exact moment. She thought of her father's betrayal, of the terror of that first night, of every small kindness and genuine conversation that had slowly rebuilt her capacity to trust, to hope, to genuinely love again after everything that had tried to convince her such things were impossible. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Yes, completely and without reservation." The hall erupted in applause and celebration as Draven rose, sliding the ring onto her finger before pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could, of everything they had built together despite the darkness of their beginning. Merrin caught sight of her mother among the household staff gathered near the edges of the hall, tears streaming down her face, genuine joy evident despite everything complicated that remained unresolved between them. Fiona whooped loudly from somewhere near the warriors section, and even Greta, normally so composed, dabbed quickly at her eyes with a handkerchief, clearly moved by the sincerity of the declaration she had just witnessed. As the celebration continued around them, Draven pulled Merrin slightly aside, away from the immediate crush of well-wishers, allowing them a brief moment of quiet amid the joyful chaos. "No regrets?" he asked softly, searching her expression carefully. "None," Merrin said, with complete certainty. "My father sold me here, believing I was nothing more than currency to settle his debts. He could never have imagined that in doing so, he delivered me to exactly where I was always meant to be, standing beside a man who saw my worth long before I saw it myself." "You saw your own worth," Draven said gently. "I simply had the good fortune to recognize it alongside you." Outside the fortress walls, spring continued its steady transformation of the surrounding territory, green and vibrant beneath the clear sky, and within the great hall, surrounded by representatives from packs across the entire region, Merrin Ashworth stood not as a debt settled or a prize claimed, but as a woman who had survived betrayal, rebuilt her own strength, and chosen, with complete clarity and open eyes, the partnership and future she genuinely wanted for herself. Her father remained in Thornwood territory, diminished and alone, having lost not only his daughter but the wife who finally found the courage to leave him, a fitting consequence for a man who had valued profit over the people who should have mattered most to him. But Maren no longer carried the weight of his choices as her own burden. She had built something entirely new, entirely hers, in the fortress that had once felt like a prison and now, completely and genuinely, felt like home. The dream that had haunted Draven for 3 years had finally found its true meaning, not as a mysterious prophecy demanding fulfillment, but as the quiet, persistent whisper of a connection that had been waiting patiently to be discovered, nurtured, and ultimately chosen by 2 people, brave enough to build something real, from the wreckage of circumstances neither of them had asked for. And as the celebration continued long into the evening, filling the fortress with laughter and warmth that had once seemed impossible within its ancient stone walls, Maren understood, with complete certainty, that whatever challenges still awaited them in the future, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since that terrifying first night, with strength, with grace, and now, finally, with a love that had proven itself real through every single test it had already survived.